Welcome, Fiona-Jane, to the World XP podcast. It's not one that I expected to be doing anytime soon, but through a connection to Peter, who's the opera singer that we had on the last episode, we now have a PhD historian from Scotland. Here you are. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, welcome. Thank you, Eric, for saying it was okay to come on. I just had spotted that Peter's podcast was coming out, and I sort of took the chance that you might be interested, because he and I had been blethering about history and music for a while, and the connection came from, we have a historical opera singer from Aberdeen, a lady called Mary Garden, who debuted in Paris in 1901 and became a great friend of Claude Debussy. And the joke was that because her parents had moved to America when she was a teenager, the French thought she was American, the Americans thought she was French, but we knew she was Aberdonian. So it all started from there. But yeah, I'm Fiona-Jane Brown, and I do have a PhD in folklore, which, if I'd have known that I could study folklore, that would have been my undergraduate subject, but I did English and history a way back. History has been my first love, and folklore came as a sort of second to it, because especially when I'm doing walking tours, sometimes you don't let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Yeah, of course. Sometimes embellishing is not always the worst thing in the world. Mm-hmm. For the people that I know, lots of our only exposure to Scottish history, I'm going to start off with one that maybe you already know is coming, is the show Outlander. So sorry, Mom, but I've heard from Fiona-Jane that that's rubbish. Mm-hmm. So why is that rubbish?
Now, the thing, I think I've mentioned to you on email already, that the problem with Outlander, the look of it and the other bits of it, they got perfectly right, but they got the history. It's complete fantasy, because a lot of people outside of Scotland, and even when we were young at school, we were kind of taught, oh, it was English versus Scots. It was not. There was so many elements, and so many other outside elements influenced the whole thing. Basically, it was all about Charles Edward Stuart, who history knows as Bonnie Prince Charlie, wanting to get the Scottish throne and the English throne, because the Stuarts had been king of both, going back to James VI, who became king of England, Scotland and Ireland after Elizabeth I died. They were cousins, so he basically got into negotiations with her, since she never married, and he became king of both. So we have the history of England from 1605 is also the history of Scotland, because we had the same monarch. But the whole Outlander thing, of course it was a romantic book. I remember when the books came out and I thought, oh, what a cute idea. But I know that fiction writers have always romanticised Culloden, and there were so many different elements to it. It was not clear cut. It was not sort of as simple as they probably make it. And I don't watch the show, and that for that reason, my dad loves it, but he's quite happy to accept that it's fiction. But me as a historian, I can't let go of the fact, like, that never happened. So I find it hard when people mess with history. It's okay for me to do it if I do it with the reference to folklore, but when you say things, documented things, never happened, then now you're in dangerous ground. So I find it hard when people mess with history, and it's the same with things like Downton or Bridgerton. I was like, I'm not going to watch any of them, because I know it's just going to be full of modern. A lot of programs now, they're full of modern morals, and if you were in the 19th or 18th or 18th century, 16th century, the morals were so different, and people's worldview was so different. And I think some young writers today, they don't have that ability. We were trained in a university, in fact, even at school. My history teacher in high school said, if you don't know, you ask, and you can't look at what happened in 1605 like you would do in 2022. And that's something I've always borne in mind, that you've got to get into the mindset of the people from that time. And when you're really young, you don't want to do that. You just want to say, oh, this is a sensible thing. And of course, there's there's scope for doing that. There's scope, like I love Shakespeare. There's seen many modern productions of it that have been great, but within those plays, there's still that Elizabethan mindset. And of course, Shakespeare was writing for James VI as well. So I think that's it. It's the mindset, and that's why I'm fussy about it. And I've even had arguments with some of my actors when I wanted to use certain words in sketches. They're like, you can't use that. That's derogatory. It's like, well, that word would have been used at that time. And I'm not going to say the word, but some folk would be extremely offended. And I actually asked a friend who was a Catholic who it probably would have offended. And she said, well, in historical context, yeah. But she says, I think I would be uncomfortable if I heard somebody using that. I was like, even on the stage. And see, that was the thing. So you've got to be careful sometimes. But again, history's history, and we've got all sorts of different views of it, but when archaeology backs you up as well, you think,
Yeah, there's always a weird line between like what's historically accurate and then how they felt about things in that day, and then whether or not that's acceptable now. And there's always this weird line where you kind of push the line. Like all the arts are like that, comedies like that, like movies and music and stuff. There's always that sort of line where the further you push it, some people like can go all the way and like they understand that that's what would have been happening at that point of history. But yeah, it's always a weird sort of dilemma to be in.
Yeah. But I mean, to give an example of how I play with history, a few of my tours, I call them ghost tours, but it's not, I have done paranormal, but that's separate, paranormal investigations. But the ghost tours, as I termed them, were always the tours that I spoke about either spooky things, about crime, true crime, and things going back where there's a sort of horror element to it. And of course, it's actually now, it has been for a very long time, a sort of an actual thing within the tourism industry, that dark history, dark tourism is extremely popular. Like the Edinburgh ghost tours are absolutely legendary, and a lot of weird and wonderful things happen on them. But I mean, when I say a ghost tour, I basically mean I'm doing street theatre and I've got people playing characters, historical personages from the time, and it's more a sort of time travel thing. So, for example, I'm starting my tours in a couple of weeks' time for this year. I have my true crime tour.
Real quick before you go into the tours, can you kind of give some background for those listening that might not know exactly what you are speaking about?
Okay, yeah. In 2011, I came back from working down in the south of England. I was working in Portsmouth for their council down there. Intriguingly enough, working on an archive, very big British archive on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Came back, and before I'd gone to Portsmouth, I was there 6 months. I had a gang of friends who were photographers, and they were always looking for new places to go. And this was kind of when it was just Facebook and Instagram, TikTok and everything. None of that existed back then. And I said, oh, hey, I'll take you around Old Aberdeen. That's the medieval buildings that we have left. Most of them are up at the old university, which was my main alma mater, King's College. And it was founded in 1495. And the old college, which was completed in 1500, still there. And the chapel and everything. And we've got our medieval St Margaret Cathedral not very far, just up the road. So I took them round there, I did a bit of research and was quite happy to tell them stories about the places we'd been in. Now, bearing in mind, before I went away, I was working at a tourist attraction out in the county, out in Aberdeenshire, which was called Archaeolink. And it was, I don't know if this has ever existed in the States, but we had a Stone Age and Iron Age theme park. That's what it was. It was based on an archaeological site, and it was on a hill, and it was not far from what is one of the historically believed sites of an ancient 1st century battle between the Romans and the indigenous Iron Age tribes. called the Battle of Mons Graupius. Now that's where I learned to be a tour guide. It was at Archeolink. We dressed up in Iron Age gear, and we took schools round and told them all the different things. And we had buildings that were built in the way they should have been built, with like we had an Iron Age roundhouse that was built with wattle and daub, and took great delight in telling the school pupils, yes, do you realise what this stuff is made of? Horse poo and straw. They loved that. And the sort of, we used to tell them about what the Celts would do if they caught a Roman and managed to kill him. They would cut his head off and stick it on a stake outside their roundhouse. And especially young boys, they loved that kind of gore. So I'd already been trained how to memorise things. And so when I came back for Portsmouth, all my pals were like, hey, you promised to do a true crime walk for us. When are you going to do it? So I did it. And the anniversary is actually coming up. It's the 9th of April. And that'll be my 11th company anniversary, the very first tour I ever did. And it was this same one, it was called Blood and Granite, after a historical book that was written by a local journalist, sadly no longer with us, Norman Adams, was a fantastic researcher. And he'd written an awful lot about true crime, about grave robbing, all sort of things. So that was the first tour. And over the years, I just developed them. And that first Halloween, I decided, hey, I'm going to get some of my mates together and let them play people from the past. And that's how it kicked off. And apart from only one event I managed to get in 2020, last year was back to normal, kind of, and we did our Halloween event. So I've done a mixture of walks. It's walks around the city and different themes. We have, true crime. We have just local history of certain buildings. Aberdeen had an awful lot of cinemas. Around about the 1950s, we would have had about 35 cinemas. And if you think about how cinemas have lots of screens today, we've kind of almost got the same amount of screens, even though we've only got 3 cinemas. So all these beautiful buildings, some of them Art Deco, some of them even older than that, had a walk round. And then World War II stuff we've got. We've got a few different ones in different places, like there's our 2 fishing communities, Tory and Footdee. I go and speak about the history of them because Tory was an independent place. It was in another county until a bridge was built across the River Dee. Because for those of you that don't know where Aberdeen is, even though there are 37 Aberdeens in the world, ours was the first. We're in the northeast of Scotland. We're nearer to Norway than we are to London. In fact, my own hometown of Peterhead, which is 35 miles north of Aberdeen, is twinned with the Norwegian town of Ålesund, and Aberdeen has had connections with Bergen as well, and there's always been trade connections from earliest medieval times. So we've got, and again, the Romans knew where we were because but in the 2nd century there was this famous map by this Greco-Egyptian geographer called Ptolemy. He did stuff for the Romans as well, but he had this map of Britain, and it's kind of skewed at a sort of 90-degree angle. So where we are in the northeast, it's kind of skewed, but you see the port of Devana. That was what they called our river, River Dee. But we have 2 rivers. In fact, we actually have more than 2. A lot of them are underground. But the Dee and the Don kind of bookmark Aberdeen, either end, bookend Aberdeen. So we've got the Don in the north and the Dee in the south. And it was the Dee that the Romans must have been aware of. And for them to have gone to Benahee, where the Battle of Mons Graupius is supposed to have happened, they would have had to come up our river. So they called it Devana, probably after one of their river goddesses, or the fact that the Celtic word for a river goddess is very similar to the Latin. They might have heard it and thought that was it. And they called it Devana. And the place on the map where you see it, Ptolemy calls it the city of the Tazali. Now that's the name he gave to our whatever our Iron Age tribe we had living in Aberdeen at the time. So we've been there for a very long time, and even further back. The oldest settlement further up the Dee, about 20 miles up the Dee, dates back 6,000 years. So we've been here for a long time. That was actually, it was the remains of a communal hall. It was a place called, the farm was called Balbredy, and the post holes and the fire pit, the archaeologists found that in the 1960s, and they dated it around 3,800 BC. So
you have plenty of stuff to tour with then.
Yeah, even I do have a tour, the medieval and prehistoric tour, that like goes from our prehistoric outside our maritime museum. In fact, it actually starts just up the hill from where we reckon Ptolemy said that the port of Davana was, and then ends up beside a stone circle, which again would have been Neolithic, late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. So yeah, it's there. But I think the difference with my tours is in Edinburgh and places like York in England, and again the big cities there, a lot of their stuff still exists. Mm-hmm. I was always keen to know, well, what was there before. I had an obsession with knowing what was there before, even in my hometown. And when I was, after I did my first degree, I went to library school and did a diploma in librarianship. And it was while I was there, getting taught more about how to find sources, which had already been taught as a historian, but this was even better. And I got rather obsessed with those cinemas and obsessed with finding out where they'd all been. And I did that. And that was one of the seeds that was planted towards doing the tours, apart from Archaeolink. And that was the thing. It was always wanting to know what was there before. So when I go on a walk, I'll either have stories that people have told me or I've found in books that other writers have done, and I've gone and checked their sources. And sometimes I go back to the actual archives, because we've got a World Heritage rated archive in Aberdeen, our council records going back to the early 14th century. And we even have our founding charter that was given to us in 1176 AD by William the Lion, King of Scots. And sometimes there's fascinating stuff in those records. Okay, admittedly, a lot of the early ones are in Latin, and I don't have Latin, not really at all. I know bits, but from about early 1700, you'd start going into Scots, and I can read that. So there's an awful lot to be said to people. And then if it's more within living memory, you might have photographs to show people. And again, we have a very big photographic archive in Aberdeen with the council and with the newspapers. And I use that as well as a guide to show people. And again, the older the customers are, and you'll notice, again, from that, the fact it's lots of local people come on my tours, or people that, I had a couple come once with their son about 6, 7, 8 years ago, and the woman just sent me a photograph of their son who's now going to university, and but her husband's father was from Aberdeen, so the man knew wee bits of it. He knew the names, but he didn't know what it looked like. So I was able to show him, oh, this is what it looked like when your father lived here. So again, there's people that are maybe expats or they've got ancestral connections, and they're all keen to know about it. So I try to really, that's why my company is called Hidden Aberdeen Tours, because I try and get people to look past what's there. And I can pick out little things. There's maybe little remnants. I could say, oh, well, you see that there? That's part of this building that used to stand here. Or I'll tell the story. And that's how I got into adding on the street theatre, because I wanted it not to just be my voice. I'm serving history. I'm serving my customers. So I'm getting people to play the characters. And it makes it all the better. I mean, as I say, I'm primarily a storyteller, but I love the fact that I can get people to kind of get my audience to sort of think, this is what it was really like to get an insight into stuff that is beyond living memory. And again, before we go back to speaking about the ghost tours, that's kind of what I try and do. It's my ethos about
So when you
uncovering what's there.
so when you have the people dress up and stuff, do you give them scripts, or like how does that kind of work? Like when you're like walking down the street or whatever, do you have people who are just kind of waiting for you to come by with the group, and then they go into their little thing, and then you go to the next one?
Okay, well, what happens on like the tours that I do during the year, not the big specialist ones, which we tend to do at Halloween. I've got there's about a dozen people I know I can call on, and there's one or two of my actors know all the scripts for the male characters, and I can just call them up and say, "Are you free to do this character?" And like Isaac, who's sort of one of he's sort of my mainstay character, because he knows most of the male characters, and they're usually rather reprehensible rascals, and he loves playing them. So yeah, and I try and, I mean, I'm not too fussed about, as long as it looks vaguely accurate, the costume, because again, I'm on a budget as well. I can't afford all these big cosplay stuff, so I make a lot of things. I'm not the greatest seamstress, but the difference with street theatre, it's like theatre in the round. Your audience is all round, and the actors have taken a while to get used to that, because I once had a guy who was, again, I'm talking local actors, local Aberdonians, that are either have done amateur dramatics or they've done a few small professional roles, or they've done stuff for the council. And what we do, we tend to, again, I'll use the example that I was going to talk about earlier about the murder history tour, as it's subtitled, Blood and Granite. So Isaac plays there's three characters that he could play, but he plays one character when we're just doing it, and sometimes we've done the two sketches in it, because the tours are about 2 hours long, and we're walking quite a lot of the time, and I stop and start at different points, so it's site specific. So for instance, the tour starts at one of our burial grounds, Trinity Cemetery, and it's on a historic site. It's on the site of where the local militia, which was built up in the 15th century, would have practiced. They would have, first of all, practiced their archery skills, then it would have been their rifle skills and whatever. And it was called a Wappenshaw. Now, many places in Scotland had that, and that's basically, Wappenshaw is actually an Anglo-Saxon term, which means weapon showing. So your local militia, and they would all be volunteers, would be trained up, and every year they would have to present whatever weapons they had, like their rifles or their axes or their swords, just to see that they could defend the city. So we go through there, and then we go to where our gallows hill was, from about I would say the beginning of the 16th century. And we got there, and Isaac's hiding, because the hill's still quite shaped like a hill, but there's these dips, and our local football ground, Aberdeen football ground's just beside it. So there's this lane, and Isaac can sort of hide there, and he's dressed up as Johnny Milne, who was Aberdeen's last recorded executioner. And he knows there's a queue line, and we'll always have a problem in that site because the sound travels weirdly. And again, we got it set out so he can hear my cue line, and I'll say something, and it'll cause him to pop out, and then he'll say, he'll have his opening line, and it's, and "Fara this rabble, what are you doing here? This is meant to be curfew." And he acts like the character. And yeah, I write the scripts, and I write a skit between us, and I say that they're little skits, really. And his story is that he was a petty thief himself, the real life character, and he ended up being able to escape being transported to Australia because there was a vacancy for the town's executioner. And his wife was rather a nippy sweetie, as we called them. She was a bit of a harridan, and she said, "Right, Johnny, you better take that job, because this job comes with a house and wages, and I'm fed up of you landing in trouble." So he took the job. First person he's asked to execute 2 years into his job is this man, Andrew Hossack, who's a thief. And he's going to be executed for theft, because in those days, it all depended on the value of the goods you stole. So he had broken into this nice mansion out in the countryside, and he'd been hauled up for that. But the rumour went flying round that Hossack was responsible for a murder that had happened 13 years before. And the whole execution ended up being turned into a riot, because although hanging went fine, and again, it wasn't on that site, it was actually down in the main town, right outside where our old jail, our old Tolbooth Museum is to this day. And in those days, when you were hanged for certain crimes, serious crimes like murder, fire raising, rape, treason, your body would either be left to rot up on the gallows or be given to the anatomy school, because there was a shortage of corpses for dissection. Now, because this Hossack was being hanged just for theft, they just had to put his body in a shallow grave. They weren't allowed in law to take his body, but that never stopped the anatomy students or professional grave robbers. So anyway, the crowd starts shouting out, "Oh, take Hossack to the anatomist, he's a murderer," and all this. And Johnny's daughter, she was taking his cart along, so the body could be put on it to go away for its shallow burial. They would just put it in a plain wooden box. And they actually managed to separate her from the pony, and the crowd unhitched the pony, shooed it away into the crowd, and Johnny was so angry that his daughter was being treated like this, he screamed at them, and they just laughed at him, and he resigned on the spot. So Isaac and I's interaction is him as Johnny telling the story, and me teasing him constantly and saying, like, when he first comes up, he's kind of really puffed up and proud, and he's got this what you call a tam o' shanter hat on with the feathers in it. I've got peacock feathers in it and everything. I made it like that. And he says, "Oh, I am the toon's executioner after all." And I says, "Oh, aye, only because nobody else wanted the job." And I say something like, "Surely it was because you were feared to go to Australia." And then he says something rude to me in Scots, and I says, "But you tell him the story, what happened to you." So he tells about how he escaped transportation, and then I wind him up about what happens with Hossack, and then he sort of says, "Oh, stop interrupting me, I'm going to tell my story." And sometimes there's enough scope, doesn't matter who's actually doing the part, there's enough scope for them to play with the audience, to banter with the audience. And a couple of times, with another character, we've had Australians on the tour, so any mention of transportation or anything, they can banter with them, and it's been done before. And so that's how it works, yeah. And like at the end of that sketch, as Johnny, he's got his birch rod, because that was one of the things that the executioner was also allowed to do. He was in charge of giving out minor punishments, like hitting somebody with a birch rod, which is the same as whipping them, really. The cat o' nine tails was only a mite worse than a birch rod. So I actually made one. I just bought stuff at the garden centre, all these sticks, and I peeled off the edges so that all the thorns stuck out, and put it onto a pole so it looks like a birch. And he threatens the crowd with it, and he's like, "Now, like, you'll have to behave, because you didn't want to feel the nip of my birch," and he bangs it in his hand. And then the crowd, they're killing themselves laughing by this time. And then he stomps off, and usually everybody erupts and sort of clapping. The whole point is that I know what the cue line is, and I know who's coming and who's coming out, and nobody else does, unless they've been on the tour before. But usually if they come back, they don't tell whoever they've taken with them, and it's a surprise. It's not meant to be a scare surprise, but it's meant to be "Oh, you're not expecting this" kind of thing. We save the scares for Halloween, but that's kind of how it works.
Yeah, that's how recently I've got back. I've found a couple of history channels on YouTube that I've been watching, and I always liked history in school, but sometimes it's very dry when you're being taught, and so I would learn on my own often. But when history is made entertaining in that way that you're describing, it's like that for any subject, really. But there's so many opportunities to learn outside of just school, that it's really cool to see that like you're taking the initiative to do things like that, because you're passionate about it, obviously. But there's so much information out there that's presented in a more entertaining way than just school that is good. It's good because it's the more you know, like it's history is important to like to kind of grasp and understand how people work and relationships work and all that stuff. So it's really cool that you're doing it. All right, now to the ghost tours, to the fun stuff.
Oh yes.
You've been waiting to talk about this for the whole 40 minutes that we've been talking.
Well, the thing is that the actual when we do things at Halloween, I mean, Halloween was always important in Scotland because our Celtic ancestry, whether you're Pictish or Irish Celtic, because everybody kind of believed the same sort of thing, and they had but it was certain seasons were important, and Samhain was always important because that was the Celtic New Year. And when I do a Halloween show, I just throw every bit of folklore at it, and I never let on whether I've like invented a story or gotten a story from a poem or something. I don't let on Halloween. I will happily explode myths when I'm doing a straight history tour, but not on Halloween. So, for instance, this past Halloween, we were back in Old Aberdeen doing my favourite ghost tour, and there are quite a few ghosty stories that we indulge in, and but I won't go into. I'll say what happens at the start of that, but I'm going to tell you about another tour which was a special one-off, and very strange things happened that night. In fact, they happened on the run-up to it as well. Anyway, so Old Aberdeen this year, we're standing outside medieval King's College, and I start the spiel about Samhain is the Celtic New Year. It was the end of the summer, and we're going into winter and the dark time of the year. And the Celts believed that they had to burn fires to encourage the light to come back in Beltane, which again is the May Day, because the Celts again all had this universal understanding that fire was a purifier. So it wasn't just for good luck, it would be to purify any disease. And of course, pandemic, like some fire festivals would have been very useful. Anyway, most of the ones I know of that still carry on had to be cancelled, which was annoying. So, and then I also say, oh well, there were the people, and then people that believed how that's a time of year that it's kind of a liminal time of year. It's a hinge between the spirit world and the real world, and that's when spirits walk. It's also the witches' Hangman, the witches' New Year. So I throw all of that at it. And then again, there's been strange things that have happened. Not, it's like sometimes they happen completely outside what you consider to be a spooky time. But there was this event that we did back in 2016, and it was much more like a promenade theatre show, less of a tour, because it was mostly indoors in the old medical school down in Aberdeen, in the centre of Aberdeen, Marischal College, which was a separate university originally. It was founded in 1595, 100 years after King's. King's had been the Catholic university, this was the Protestant university, and the medical school was there from 1700. Now, the two universities joined up in 1860, and now we still have two universities, because Robert Gordon's college, which was a technical college, got university status in 1998, and that's 94, because it was 95, 96 I went there to library school. But in the time when the desire for corpses basically outstripped supply was the early 1800s, right up till 1832, when the Anatomy Act was passed, which basically legally allowed people to leave their bodies to medical science, or for doctors, teaching doctors to acquire corpses for dissection. So I decided, we got a team together, and we actually got funding for this because it was a really big undertaking. So we decided to hold it in the old medical school, because at that time, medical school had moved up to the main hospital. From 2006, it was up at our main hospital, Aberdeen Royal Infirmary. So it'd been empty for years. And then the university decided to lease it out. And the first half of it was leased out to as studios for artists. And the other half had not been leased out at that time. So I was able to ask permission and get permission to do this show. So we had the old lecture theatre. We had the huge big dissection room, which, as I say, students had been using right up until 2006 to dissect their bodies. And it used to be a standing joke that in Freshers' Week, any first year medical students, you got to see Marshall, gone to Marshall to see the bodies, because the medical students were the worst behaved students in the whole university. They were the worst for pranks, the worst for drinking, and the worst for any sort of shenanigans. So, cashing in on that love of that kind of thing and shenanigans, I wrote a piece which was all about that. And it's based on a tour that I have called Workers and Body Snatchers. So that building was not the original. In fact, there had been 3 buildings on that site. The original site had been a monastery from 1470. And then when the obviously Reformation, 1560, any Catholic property, again, was either taken over by the council or given to the crown. In this case, it ended up that the crown claimed it and gave it to a nobleman, James VI? It was James VI, gave it to a nobleman called George Keith, and his title was Earl Marshal. And that meant that his family were hereditary royal bodyguards to the king, and they looked after the royal regalia as well. So George Keith, being a Protestant himself, he got the old college, the old monastery from the king, because he said, well, I want to set up a university and I want to train Protestant priests and whatever. 1700 we get the medical school, as I said. So, site of a monastery. In 1740, very famous Scottish architect William Adam designs them a new college, and it's there's a drawing of it and it looks quite Gothic. And then in 1835, they replaced it. So that medical school that we were doing the show in was 1835. But the stuff that happened, I think, dated back to that earlier medical school. There was all sorts of things. And it was funny because the guy that was kind of in charge of running the artist studios, he was deaf against me saying anything about ghosts. He's like, oh, don't scare them, don't scare the students. I was like, I'm a folklorist. This is my bread and butter sort of thing. This is what this whole show's about. But he really had no say in the matter because he was only a tenant at the university himself. So we were in there rehearsing for a couple of weeks before the show. I think about 3 weeks in total. And as it came closer and closer to Halloween, because we were doing it over Halloween weekend, because Halloween was a Monday, and we were doing it on the Sunday as well. And the closer it got, the weirder things started to happen. There was one night, and I just used to wind people up and say, oh, there's this happening. And then one night, genuinely, about 11 o'clock, the cast had gone home, and I was just checking all the doors were shut, and my colleague, he was in another part of the building. And I swore that I came out of the lecture theatre, into this big main corridor, and I heard footsteps, and I saw my colleague standing across from me. And I knew we were the only 2 people in the building. And I just smirked at him and I says, oh, there's the ghostie. And I shouted out, I says, I'm not scared of you. Fine. So, but Halloween night, that is when things got very weird. Now, I didn't experience all the weirdness, but this is the story that I just was so keen, and Peter's so keen to hear as well. I just love this story. I told it to a friend who's a paranormal investigator himself, and he didn't know of any hauntings related to Marshall College. And I'm like, well, I'll tell you this. And I'm going to kind of tell you in back to front order, because what had happened, as I say, I never experienced it, and I didn't know till a couple of days later I got the backstory from basically, it was my friends that were helping out. They'd been sitting in another part of the building. But anyway, when we finished on the Monday night, we'd a huge big tidying it up to do because we'd done 3 runs and this was us. We had to get out and have everything out with all sorts of bits and pieces to move. I ended up being left to do most of it. And there was about 3 or 4 of us left later on, tidying up. And the first strange thing that I noticed, apart from that hearing footsteps that time, there was one room, didn't have any curtains in it, so I put up black bin bags over the window because there was a light shining in, and we needed this room to be completely black for one of the scarier skits that we did on the tour. And I was taking down the black bags, and the only chair we could get was a spinny office chair. So my friend Chloe was holding the chair steady while I climbed up and pulled off this bin bags. And I said, oh, well, that's it. And I went back through the kitchen to put the bags in the bin. And I had seen her coming after me, switching off the light, pulling the door shut. And she says, oh, I'll just have a look round the other corridor, make sure all the lights are off. And then she comes back because the way the building's configured, so it's a lecture theatre, there's a little old museum, there's the dissection room, there's stairs going down to the old morgue, which we never got to use, sadly, but it's there. And then there's all these studios, which were classrooms. So you can actually loop all the way around behind these classrooms in this project room as well. So Chloe comes back through the other way, and she said, we put the light off in that room, didn't we? I was like, of course we did, I saw you doing it. She says, I just went back, the light's on and the door's open. I was like, oh, I says, the ghost's having a laugh with us, is it? And she looks at me, and I didn't know till later, the look on her face, I should have realised that something else had happened, because she was one of the people that experienced the true haunting that happened that night. So I was like, oh, Flake. I said, look, I'll come back with you, we'll put the light off together. So we did. Left the building. About, I don't know how many days later, but it was another friend. There'd been about 6 of them sitting in this room, which basically is in the middle of the building. And they had been sitting there. And in the lecture theatre, there was part of the story where we're kind of reenacting, which is basically an urban legend, where there was always this story it used to go about. It was set in different places. Sometimes it was set at King's College, sometimes it was set at Marshall, where this guy was so dead drunk, like he collapsed in the street. Medical students found him, and again, you can pitch this in any time you want that they were actually still stealing bodies, and they thought he was dead, so they picked him up, took him in, and decided to start dissecting him. But of course, he wasn't dead, and the story goes that the minute they cut him open, he jumped up screaming and his guts were falling out, and he tried to escape and sort of bled out outside. So we had written this into the story, and the lead actor who was playing the drunk guy, already the group have seen him being dragged in, and they think, and the group know, hey, he's not dead. And so anyway, they haul him inside, and he's lying on a table, and there's a sheet over him. So when I take the group in, they go and sit in the seats in the lecture theatre, and the characters are playing. There's 2 doctor lecturer characters, and then there's about 4 students. And so again, they pull the sheet off, and then the doctor starts doing all this spiel. And a friend of mine, who again might be a good interviewee for you, Lindsay Fitzharris, who's a medical historian, fantastic writer herself, I'd actually consulted her. I says, what would the medical knowledge have been like in 1800? And she said, oh, well, there's this and this. So I kind of incorporated that into the script. And then again, the character who's playing the doctor makes a show of cutting open the stomach of the corpse, in inverted commas. Now, of course, it's a fake scalpel, and lead actor, he's actually got a cow's heart. Now, I never use animal parts when we do the actual standard tours. I've got these I make up intestines out of its tights filled with cotton wool and covered in fake blood. But he insisted, he's like, oh, I want real meat was less. And I was like, oh, fine, go to the butcher's then. So he went to his local butcher's and bought a cow's heart. And he cut it in bits to use on each run of the tour. And so he sits bolt upright and he's holding this, and you can see it's starting to seep through his hands, and he's covered it in stage blood as well. And again, he's got a blood capsule. We did the whole as bloody as possible in terms of the look of it. He jumps up, he does his thing, and again, because he's cut the thing in bits, he deliberately lets bits of this cow heart fall on the ground, and people are like, ah! And I'm standing there trying to not laugh because I know what's happening. So he runs off, and they kind of do a bit of a comedy chase outside. Now, my friend Howarth, who was one of the 6 people sitting in the project room, he said to me, he says, maybe you didn't want to hear this, but there's something very strange happened. I was like, yes, please tell me all. So he says, when Alec came running out, he came bursting into the project room, which again, there'd be like maybe 6-7 feet difference in the corridor between the lecture room and where they were sitting, which again had a door and a wall. A glass panelled wall, but all the same, it was sectioned off. And Chloe later confirmed this and said that they were sitting there. He comes bursting in and starts shouting at them, saying, who was it that made that stupid screaming noise? And they looked at him and said, we thought that was you. We thought that was you for inside the lecture theatre. And he says, no, it's somebody else. And, tell him to behave. And they're like, wasn't us. And he was in such a state of agitation, he didn't challenge them any further, but because he knew he had to come back. And I said, well, what was it? And Howarth and Chloe both said, Howarth particularly, he described this as hearing a male scream, a real blood-curdling scream, cut short, as if somebody has been killed, basically. And I thought, ooh, interesting. And Chloe, who does have a bit of, she admits she has a bit of psychic ability, and she sometimes senses things and sees things that the normal, ordinary person wouldn't. So I trusted her judgment on that. And she says, I saw a face, high up. And I was like, really? And she says, yeah, it was and she described exactly where she'd seen the face, and she said it was faint, but it was like a face of a man up high in the skylights. I was like, okay. And it took me a while to start thinking about it because there was other things that happened. And then I figured out, oh, wait a minute now. There was a man who was hanged in, now what date is it? 1821. He was hanged for the murder of his brother-in-law. He basically tried to poison all his in-laws so he could get the estate that belonged to his wife and her siblings. Their parents had left them well off, and he just basically wanted to bump them all off and not tell his wife that her brothers and sisters were about to be murdered by her own husband. But he fails. He only ends up poisoning his brother-in-law, and his sister-in-law, she had thought it very strange. She didn't want to touch the body or see the body. And again, she started thinking an old superstition, how if you touch a body, if the murderer touches a body, it's meant to bleed. And sort of show the guilt of the murderer. So the sister-in-law had then found a receipt for arsenic. She went straight to the local sheriff and said, you might want to have a chat with my brother-in-law. So he ends up getting executed. And because he's a murderer, as I said, his body gets taken over to Marischal College to be dissected. But 4 years before, the book Frankenstein was published by Mary Shelley, the writer. And in that year, in 1818 or 1819, I think it might have been 3 years before, the book was published in the January of that year. And in the November, at Glasgow Medical School, there was this experiment done. And it involved what they called the Galvanic Arc. And this is going back to the very early understanding of electricity. And there were two doctors at Marshall College, Charles Skene and Alexander Ewing. They wanted to replicate this experiment. This actually is the forerunner of creating the defibrillation device, which you see on medical dramas, that they jerk the person's heart back into life. This is the very infancy of this kind of knowledge. And the guy that had done it in Glasgow was a chemist called Andrew Urey, and he had wanted to see if it was possible to restart somebody's heart, because he thought that might be a way of saving people that had drowned. So he had a good motive for doing it. But Dr. Ewing and Dr. Skene, I think they were a bit of glory hunters, and they just wanted to show off. And Dr. Skene wasn't the nicest of people, in that he didn't believe in teaching his students. He believed that they should just follow him around like little apprentices, because teaching medicine was something that they didn't do till a bit later on in time, and there were other pioneers that did that. But Skene was one of the old school and thought that a surgeon was like God. So I suppose he was very into glory hunting. But again, they wanted to prove that they could do what Urey hadn't done, that they could start the heart again, or at least get the creature to breathe. Anyway, poor George Tom, our hanged murderer, his corpse gets taken in. It's just come off the gallows and still warm, apparently, because they used to just leave the body hanging for about 40 minutes and then take it over. So they were going to do their experiment to start with, and they had this old-fashioned battery, with glass jars full of different kinds of acids and copper plates, and this is how the electricity sparked through them. And again, it's friction sparks that set it off. So they had figured out different nerves from reading what Urey had done with his experiment. Different nerves would trigger different muscles. They didn't totally understand that, but that's what was happening. So they do various things. They get the corpse's hands to move and whatever, because they cut open the muscle and they do all their bits and pieces. And then they cut open the vagus nerve, which is the one in your neck that goes down to your heart. And this is the one that Urey had tried, but he'd not managed to get the heart to restart. But they managed to get the lungs to inflate, and we don't know whether they got the heart to restart or not. But anyway, they did everything, and they were fairly satisfied that they had proved that they could do everything that this Glaswegian chemist had done, and they could do it as well. There we go. So that was it. They carried on with their dissection. Years later, on from their experiment, in the 1850s, 60s, there was this journalist, and I don't know if he was Glaswegian or what, but he wasn't from Aberdeen, and he had heard the story about the Glasgow experiment, and he'd probably heard the Aberdeen one as well, and he wrote this piece, and he basically went all Hollywood on it and said that the murderer's body in Glasgow, that they'd brought him back to life, and he'd risen up, and Urey had to stab him to death with a scalpel, because he was threatening to they thought, oh, well, he's dead, he's come back from hell, we can't have this. And of course, people started believing this story. It was complete nonsense. And there's a fantastic book about it, which I think is called something like Bringing Back the Dead or whatever. And so I thought, oh, that's gold. That's absolute gold. So that's what I created a sketch about that. And then I thought to myself, okay, well, wait a minute. Hanging was not an exact science. This is your big takeaway from this, that when people were hanged prior to the 20th century, they really didn't understand that you needed a longer drop, at least twice the height of the person, to create what's called the hangman's fracture, and that you knock out the bones that'll hit the brainstem and kill you instantly. So within a couple of seconds you'd be dead, and that's how they did what we'd call modern hangings up until 64, till it was banned in Britain. And so sometimes when people were taken off the gallows before that period, before they started making it into a bit of a science, they might not actually have been dead. They might have just been really choked and in a sort of coma state. And there's a story of a woman in Edinburgh that had happened to. Her name was Margaret Dixon, and poor woman, she had been working in a big house, gotten pregnant by the landlord or whatever, very well-known story, and she'd killed the baby. Now, she was going to be hanged for killing the baby, infanticide. And when they cut her down from the grass market in Edinburgh, and they were taking the body away for dissection, I think, and she sat up in their coffin or banged against it or something, and the sort of whoever it was that was in charge of the coffin, like, pulled it open, and here she was alive. So the belief then, and that was been in the 18th century, that was quite a while ago, because she's known as Half Hingit Maggie in Edinburgh. There's a pub that's named after her, and they said, oh, well, that's God's judgment. She must have been not guilty. God's given her another chance to live, so she's free and that's it. So I thought, well, okay, that's just like her biology saved her. She wasn't choked. She wasn't entirely choked to death, and she didn't like have her neck broken. What if, I thought, the same happened with George Tom? He wasn't properly dead when they cut him down, and they said the body was still warm. What if one of those electricity surges had started his heart again, and they hadn't realised? And what if they thought, when they were finished their experiments and they started on the dissection, what if when they cut him open he was not dead, and that was the scream that our lead actor and 6 of my friends heard? And there were 40 of us in that lecture theatre. None of us heard it. They did. And Chloe saw something. And I thought, either we woke up George Tom's ghost, or, you know, sometimes they speak on the programmes like Ghost Hunters and everything about a residual event that kind of gets triggered on. And I don't think it was even the anniversary we did it on, but it being Halloween would maybe triggered something, an echo from the past. And the fact that we weren't in the building, we weren't in the actual building that it had happened in. That was a previous building. And what if the layout was different, and that's why Chloe saw the face? And I, like, then put 2 and 2 and 2 together and like get 8 and say, well, or 6, and say, well, that, as far as I'm concerned, is a good explanation for that unexplainable thing that happened. So as far as I'm concerned, that was a haunting, and that's my famous tour haunting story.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. I remember reading about different people that weren't, like, when they were hung, either they weren't dead and they were paralyzed, or like all sorts of things like that. So I mean, yeah, that would make sense if he was like unconscious and then he woke up as they were doing it. Yeah, I mean, I don't know, I wasn't there, but yeah,
It's great. It's really, I think it's a plausible explanation. And I mean, as a folklorist, I'm trained to not care if it's not care, but not to be too hung up on the veracity. It's more why people believe that. And it's like, when that journalist was prompted to write that fantasy piece, he was obviously writing because he knew some people would believe him. And again, people, and the whole point of stealing bodies, people didn't like the idea of cutting open a body. I mean, it goes right back to the 16th century, when you've got a Belgian anatomy surgeon, Andreas van Vezel, or he's known by his Latin name Vesalius. He could have been quite likely was censured by the church, and he acquired his bodies secretly, but he wrote the first proper human anatomy textbook, because the previous one that had been written by the Roman writer Galen had been proven to be about animal anatomy he'd used, and Vesalius worked this out. And so again, And people, again, the church was like, you cannot cut open all these bodies. There are lithographs and woodcuts showing people's fears about this, that they thought, well, on Judgment Day, if you've been dissected, you can't be like raised up whole because all your bits are everywhere. But again, that's a misunderstanding of resurrection as well. But again, people had this genuine fear because of their lack of understanding, that they thought, well, this is sacrilege because the body, in Christian terms, is the temple of the Lord, and if you're a Christian, that's what you believe. So to cut that open is attacking God's creation, and that's why the church condemned it. But the doctors themselves were like, they were enlightened as in terms of the European Enlightenment, and saying, but we've got to learn. How are we to learn how to cure people if we don't know what's going on inside? And that's one of my characters says that in one of the other tours. So again, it hit at a real fear, and people were frightened of being buried alive and frightened of being grabbed by body snatchers and all of that, especially after the Birkenhead murders. People were convinced that medical students went round killing people, just like Birkenhead had done in Edinburgh, which may be true or not be true.
Yeah, that's one of the weird things about the development of modern medicine. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that now we would consider like barbaric, and then even in some of like the Nazi experiments that have to do with like they did experiments on like the Jewish prisoners that they had on like how long a body could last at like such and such temperatures. Yeah. And stuff that would never be acceptable now, but as so much of that stuff has helped us with like the development of medicine, that it's almost as kind of a weird like yeah, I don't condone that, but also thanks for helping out.
Well, that's it. And one of the most famous doctors in Aberdeen, Andrew Moyer, his anatomy school was burnt to the ground in a riot in 1831, actually just on the eve of the Anatomy Act being passed. And he had to like flee to the countryside, but then he came back in triumph like about 10 years later and became the first anatomy surgeon at his brother's old university at King's, because King's Medical School was actually the oldest in Scotland. The James IV was the one that had given the charter for King's, and he'd also endowed a chair of medicine. So before Glasgow, before Edinburgh, before St Andrews, we had a medical school up in Aberdeen. But when you got Marshall coming along, like King's had kind of gone down in its reputation. So Andrew Moyer, who trained at Marshall, went back to King's and became there and kind of kicked off, reignited, I should say, their reputation as a medical school. And his brothers had studied divinity there. So, and again, it's a weird thing. He'd had the choice between divinity and medicine, and he chose medicine. And sadly, although he came back in triumph, like about 3 years later, he died of typhus fever, which he'd caught from one of his general patients. So again, in trying to, and that's what my friend Lindsay says a lot in her books about how dissection was dangerous to the students as well, because they could catch any kind of diseases off the corpses and die themselves. So again, these people were literally risking their lives to train others. So it's an amazing, emotive subject, and one of my favorites.
Yeah, I think, well, that's around that time, it was what, mid 1800s or mid 19th century. So that would have been close to when Jack the Ripper was what, the 1880s or something like that.
Yes.
So that was one of the things that they talked about with him, was that he had some anatomy knowledge, or was that was one of the like hallmarks of whoever the suspect would be. Yeah. Which is actually wild that I just listened to a thing about him like 2 days ago.
Oh yeah, I've been on one of the Ripper tours in London, and it's been speculating for years. There's so many books about it, Masonic conspiracies and whatever. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of sad now. A lot of the places where they call the canonical murders took place are disappearing in London. They've still got a few of them, but a lot of them are built over. But you'd still get this impression, like it really, I mean, that's hidden London. It's amazing. But yeah, they think that either he was a butcher or had some basic medical training. I mean, he could have been a mortician for that matter. Nobody's really worked out who he was. And there's some people think that he maybe moved to the States and some Victorian serial killers there might have actually been Jack. Who knows? But again, it fuels endless speculation, and we have our body snatchers and we have our own murderers, but we've never had a serial killer in Aberdeen, but we've had plenty of murderers.
Yeah, well, fingers crossed is one doesn't pop up soon, because that would be not fun for anyone.
Yes.
Was one thing that's wild to me about all the stories about Scotland and England and Europe and like the haunting and the folklore and all that stuff is like in the US, there's not really, the history doesn't go back that far from the standpoint, like obviously Native Americans and stuff were here, but you have buildings and structures that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, and the stories that can build up over time is just like it's nuts. Like for us, we've got like the New Orleans ghost tours around Halloween, and stuff like that, and there's some stuff in the South that has to do with like the slave trade, and those are kind of creepy. But yeah, from reading, I listened to one of your podcasts, the last one, I think. But yeah, some of the stuff you talk about is just wild.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting because I've got a friend in Newfoundland, Dale Jarvis. He's actually the provincial folklorist. And I thought, well, if that had been a job here, that would have been great. But yeah, I knew Dale from before. And our interests crossed because he tells a lot of the stories about seafaring related ghosts and whatever, and that was something I encountered because my actual doctoral thesis is about beliefs and traditions in Scottish fishing communities, and there was some of the stories in Dale's books that resonated with stories, actual testimonies I'd been told in some of the islands, especially the Western Isles. And again, as I've said, there's this east-west difference in culture in Scotland, and the West is very much Gaelic culture. I mean, it might have started off with the Irish, well, I mean, they call them invaders, but some of them were just colonists that came over from, weirdly enough, what is now Ulster, the Kingdom of Dalriada, and the Uí Neil, or the MacNeil clan, which is actually, Peter's got a connection to them, he might have told you, but there was another lesser clan that realised that the Uí Néill were going to push them out. So they hopped over to Argyllshire and started the rest of the kingdom of Dalriada over there. So they brought with them the Irish Celtic language. Our language in the East is more closer to the Welsh tongue, even though, go back 2,000 years, we're speaking the same Celtic tongue. But anyway, the stories, there's a lot, it seemed to me more so, all fisher folk had supernatural experiences or knew of superstitions or whatever, whether they believed them or not. Western Isles, there seemed to be still this understanding that I found amongst people who were evangelical Christians in the east side of the country, that there was this the unseen world, the world of demons, angels, spirits, and a lot of the folk, they might have been Catholic or Presbyterian, but they would totally believe that, and Dale had an almost identical story about a sailor who was lost at sea, and they were surprised that the body hadn't come up, because I've been told by our local lifeboat crew that eventually everybody comes up unless it's stuck under a rock or whatever. So this story that I was told by someone in the Isle of Lewis was that there was a body that had never been found, and I think it was the person who was lost, it was their brother, their older brother, kept seeing the dead brother in his dream. And then it got so intense that one night he came out of his house and there was his brother in spirit, and says, like, please come with me. I'll show you where my body is. I must be buried. Now, a lot in the East Coast, the bodies do never come back, because it's just, if you're out in the middle of the North Sea or up in the Icelandic waters, you're never going to see them, because they're just going to sink with with frostbite or whatever. And so this person who was talking to told me the story and said that this again was a distant ancestor of theirs, and that he'd gone with a spirit, and the spirit had shown him where in this clutch of rocks. And sure enough, the next day they go down, and somebody dives down, they pick up the body. Dale's got an identical story, and I have a story that's very similar over in just East Coast, across about 20 mile, no, about an hour and a half north-west of me, the town of Banff, and it's on the River Devon. And this is a 20th century story, and a guy called Dennis Wilson told me this, and he said that there had been someone else because again there's Banff on one side of the river, Macduff on the other side of the river. There'd been somebody lost at sea, and somebody had had a visitation or a dream, one of the two, and had been told this is where the body is. And they went to the estuary, and they found these rocks, and the rocks kind of stuck out in a lip, and the body was jammed underneath it, and it was there exactly where the dream had said. So even if there's not long history in a place, if there's been, again, lots of horrible, sad things happen, loss of life, again, it's what you're mentioning about things being in the air, in the fabric of the buildings. That's what they call the stone tape theory. And it's a very popular folkloric theory, but again, scientifically it doesn't make sense. But there must be something, because you go
that's
to
why it's fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah, you feel it. I mean, like, anytime I go to Culloden, it's a sad feeling there. Go to Bannockburn, where we kicked the English's butt in. Let me get this correct, not English. The Anglo-Norman army's butts in 1314. It's a very light spirit there. Everything's kind of, yes. Well, for us anyway. But no, there's something in that. And again, the people that have mediumship ability, psychic ability, they sense it, they sense something. And even somebody that I would have a sort of balanced viewpoint. I would be open to hearing people's stories, and I would want to know what they believed in. And then I'd say, well, but that's true for you. And it's true for whatever experience people have. It's true for them at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the North Sea and Iceland, and I read a book some time ago called The Sea of Trolls. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it's based on the Beowulf story. But one of the things that happens in the later, like it's like a trilogy, and in the later series, they come down the British Isles, and the Vikings sort of raid some of the monasteries and that sort of stuff. You mentioned also earlier that you guys are closer to Norway than you are to London. So is that a big part of the history in Aberdeen as well, the Vikings, or not so much?
Well, we're actually mentioned. Aberdeen's mentioned in a Norse saga, and Snurlson, who was a Norse bard or skald, to give him the Norse name, he mentions of how Aberdeen was attacked quite late on in time in the 13th century. Or was it 12th or 13th century? I can't remember offhand, but it's quite late, because I've told people this story before, and they're like, but surely the Vikings had stopped by then. Like, no. No, it says in this epic poem that they came to Aberdeen and they burned it to the ground, which most of our buildings were wooden apart from our castle anyway, so I'm not surprised they burned it down. But and I mean, we're always kind of, our Scottish monarchs were always having beefs with the Norwegians because they were their in-laws. That is why we got, Scotland ended up owning Orkney and Shetland, is because King Christian of Denmark, he was marrying his son to the Scottish Crown Princess, and Alexander second, who was our father, said, need a dowry, mate. And he said, oh, I don't have any money, but you can have Orkney and Shetland instead. And they're like, yes, fine, let's have that then. That was the 1260s. So before that, there was this attack. And again, the fact it's in a saga, it says that they attacked it. But we tended to have quite good relations with the Norse after that, and certainly with the Low Countries, maybe not so much the Low Countries, because I'll tell you again a funny little story about the North Sea and how it basically was our highway in the time between us and Europe. In 1408, the Kingdom of the Netherlands had cause to put sanctions up against Aberdeen because our, the provost is the name of our leader. It's kind of like a Lord Mayor. It's the Scots word. And our provost, Robert Davidson, he was a pirate on the side. Well, he was kind of like he'd gotten a letter of marque from the Lord of the Admiralty, who was the Earl of Mar, whose uncles were the Duke of Albany and the King of Scots, respectively. So the Earl of Mar, Alexander Stewart, again, had said to his drinking buddy, hey, have some letters of marque, you can go and plunder Dutch shipping. So we were told, don't you dare come here with anything. Like, we're not giving you any of our stuff. So that's a bit funny. But yeah, and Poland, there was a huge connection with Poland and Aberdeen. I was telling some journalists the other day that there's in Gdansk, there is supposed to be a suburb called Little Scotland, because we've got a lot of our merchants in the 17th century went over there to train, because there were Scots people living in Poland who were merchants and their families settled there. And again, merchants sent their sons over there, like, your cousin will train you. And our one of our last, getting late medieval buildings called Provost Skeen's house, which is, again, it's been closed for the whole of lockdown because they were working on it. It was a museum previously, but George Skeen, who ended up being the Provost of Aberdeen, he'd gone over to be trained by his half-brother, David Skeen, to be a merchant. And he was over there in Poland and with his another senior merchant, George Addy, and he taught him the merchant trade, came back, made so much money that he ended up, he never married, but he bought this house that had actually dated back to the early 16th century, and he built on this whole new wing, and thereafter it became known after him. But he was able to then, he didn't have any children, but he adopted his niece, not his half-blood niece, but anyway, his nephews were so badly behaved that he's like, well, I'm not looking after you. Like, you're drinking all your father's money and it's terrible. You're besmirching your father's memory. But your sister, now, I'm going to make something of her. And she ends up, like, her family, down to Victorian times, her descendant was a well-known Scottish historian, William Skeen. And again, all of that links right back to Poland. And it's amazing how cosmopolitan Aberdeen actually was, and yet the folk in Edinburgh and Glasgow think that we're country bumpkins. No, we've been connected to Europe for a very long time, and it wouldn't surprise me if there weren't Ukrainian and sort of Balkan links as well. There probably are, but again, it's that the North Sea was like our main motorways, and sort of, well, the main motorway in England's the M1, and you've got the M8 between Edinburgh and Glasgow. The North Sea was like that for us, and sort of medieval and into the early modern period as well. So yeah, we had dealings with Vikings, but we tended to get on with them not too badly.
Well, that's a good thing, because in all the stories that I've read, all they did was kill and pillage and plunder. So if you get along with them, all right, then
it's a bit mythical, you say, because certainly in Shetland, the Shetlanders love their Norse heritage. Mm-hmm. And before the Norse settlers came there, our indigenous Pictish Iron Age people were there, because again, the place names and the archaeology prove it. But the Norse had come there and settled. I mean, again, like the people that live in the Balkan states now, going right down into the Black Sea, all of those people were originally Norse. If you go far enough back, the Cossacks had Norse blood. The Normans, French Normans, were again Northmen. So a lot of the stories, again, you hear about Vikings, they're not entirely true. I mean, they got the Norwegians, like, again, they're very well loved by the Shetlanders and Orcadians. The Orcadians were a bit further away, they're nearer to Scotland, and they tended to be more farming related. But because the soil was so poor in Shetland, the seafaring people, most sort of people in Shetland now have some connection to the big fishing industry, the pelagic industry, and they have huge big boats and whatever. But yeah, it's again, that's a bit of a myth. The pillaging Viking, they weren't all bad. In fact, I love this. I heard this on Horrible Histories or something, and it's actually true. And I stuck it in one of my tours. I mentioned it that your local sort of medieval British male might not have been sort of well acquainted with a bar of soap, but you've got all these tall Vikings with their braids in their hair and their jewellery and everything, and they probably wore makeup as well with their war paint. Our Picts had done it before, but then it's like they didn't need to rape women. The women were like, hey, look at that guy, wow. And they would be like quite happy to go and sleep with these invaders because they were good looking and smelt nice. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but again, they were. We do get this impression now from history that the Norse people, again, were very into their like artistic culture, just like our earlier Pictish people were. I mean, you've got hoards of silver that have got the most fantastic designs on them. And the professor of archaeology at Aberdeen at the moment, Gordon Noble, who's younger than me, and he's the professor, he's been doing a lot of work recently that is changing history and is telling us so much more about how far advanced our sort of early into the sort of I would say again like maybe 7th, 8th, 9th century, which is what they call the Pectish period, because again, Pictish is a misnomer, that's what the Romans called us. But they were so far advanced, they were fantastic boat builders. They were great at building hill forts, because they would build it, they would stick straw in between the stones, set fire to them, that would vitrify your fort. The nearest hill to us, Benahee, it's got a vitrified fort on it. These people were very clever, but it seems to me they forgot a lot of their skills when they got a bit too comfy with their farming instead of going and fighting people, fighting Romans, and fighting Scots and Northumbrians. Again, you've got this anomaly that the Scots, as far as the Picts were concerned, were from Ireland, and the Picts were from the east side, and they again had this Iron Age ancestry. So it gets all very confusing, and I have to teach a lecture on this to the master students at my old department about these mythical origins of Scotland, and it gets extremely confusing, really. And it's only archaeology that helps us understand what was really going on, and you can separate the myths and the actual physical history, which helps us out.
Yeah, it seems that because the Romans would have been there like 3rd, 4th century, something like that.
They left in about the very beginning of the 5th century. So by 400 AD they were gone, and that's when you get the Germanic mercenaries, your Anglo-Saxons, your Danelaw, and then the Normans come, and it gets even messier still after that. And it's always been interesting that the indigenous Scots monarchy, we had our Pictish kings, and then we had our Scots-Irish stroke kings. Let's call them Irish for simplicity here.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 842 AD, a leader called Kenneth MacAlpin, who was effectively Irish, supposedly defeated the Pictish monarchy once and for all, and supposedly united. I mean, folks say, oh, they massacred the Picts. Well, they assimilated them, because the language that we, again, only know fragments of, and enough fragments for linguists to say, oh, well, it was a kin language to Welsh, but we don't know what they spoke before that. He's the one that created what, now the Gaelic name for Scotland is Alba, and that was MacAlpin's kingdom. And all of our kings from then on descend from him. And I had a great laugh the other day at a talk by, the Lord Lion in Scotland is a ceremonial position, and the Lord Lion is in charge of who gets the coats of arms. And that's his title. And the current one, Joseph Morrow, he's a lawyer, and he's also got a degree in divinity as well. But a colleague of his was doing a talk about this office of the Lord Lion, and then I was talking to some other people later on, and they were saying about these people that reckon they can take their ancestry back to Fergus Moyer MacEric, and that was meant to be Kenneth MacAlpin's legendary Irish ancestor. And this guy was he never existed. And again, it says something. When I was on holiday in Dublin years ago, and a tour guide who was a right sassy Irishman, he said, oh, well, most of our history's folklore anyway, so we just please ourselves. And it's like, he's actually speaking the truth. Yeah. Because you get back into the legendary tales, you've got the Welsh tales, and then you've got Cuchulainn and all of them, and then you've got our sort of Norse-influenced, Germanic-influenced characters on the other side of the country. This is when, again, I go and rely on the archaeology, because that's the only thing that can say, yes, this is what people ate here, this is what animals were here, and then I just say, oh, well, then it's folklore, and I can have fun with that, as I do with my tour characters.
Yeah, that makes sense, because once you get that far back, we'll never really know. Yeah. It's not like they didn't write everything down or whatever. So, I mean, the Romans did for a lot, but after MacAlpin, is that the first guy? So yeah. after he became king, mm-hmm. So after he became king, and then in 1066 when the Normans came into England, what was that's where I get lost in that, mm-hmm. After the Romans leave to when Normans get there, that's kind of where my history of the British Isles is very foggy. It's not very easy to find.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, what you've got and what MacAlpin was trying to rule was lots of small kin groups or clans. Clan is the Gaelic name, and it's not right to use that at this period of time. Kin group is probably the most sensible thing to say. And you've got, while the Romans were there and when they left, there were Celtic-speaking people all over Britain. And most of them would have spoken this Welsh form of language, what they call Brythonic. It's what the Picts spoke, it's what they spoke in Cornwall and Isle of Man and everything. So they were everywhere. This is, again, King Arthur's time. And there is some historical evidence for him being a real Celtic chieftain, because he's mentioned in this epic poem called the Gododin, and it's about a kin group that lived around what is now Edinburgh. And the poem was written in a form of, Welsh people can recognise it as being this Brythonic tongue. So you've got people that speak this language, and then they're slowly either pushed out or assimilated into these Germanic mercenaries that come over, as I say. As a block, they call them Anglo-Saxons, but there were all sorts of groups. And eventually, again, they sort of, their little kingships and dominations within England. Again, there was a very fluid border at that time. I mean, Northumbria was still Scotland as far as they were concerned. And they were, again, a Brythonic-speaking tribes, groups of tribes, right down as far as Yorkshire. That's why, even today, Yorkshire folk, they're like, oh, we're not English, we're Yorkshire. And you get these little pockets of very old Celtic resistance going on. So, again, it's all these little kin groups. And then what they call the Danelaw, especially in what you would say is England, one of the kin groups sort of rise up and end up leading it. And this, at Hastings in 1066, you've got Harold Godwinson, who's this Anglo-Saxon, well, probably Danish king. And he's been ruling England for a certain amount of time. And the Scots are not very keen on him either. Because at that time, you have got... in Scotland, at that time, you've got Malcolm Canmore. Malcolm the Third of Scots. And his second wife is one of these... Germanic people. She was actually born in Hungary, her family born in exile, and her father had been, it's quite possible he was murdered by Harold Godwinson. Her father was called Edmund Ironside, and he had a better claim to the throne than Harold, so Harold offed him. And she realised that, more so her mum, Agatha, who was quite possibly... and again, we don't want to use the word Russian. Rus, again,
right.
Is different to Russian as we'd understand it today. So, anyway, she had quite powerful Eastern European ancestry as well. So she said to her daughter and her son, who was also Edmund, Margaret's brother, let's get out of here. And William, the Duke of Normandy, he's French, or Norman. He reckons that through his Norse ancestry, he's got a better claim than Harold. And apparently, he comes over to England saying, hey, Harold, you promised me the throne. And Harold said, no, I didn't. And then, bang, you have these fights going on. And as the Bay of Tapestry illustrates very nicely, Harold gets shot in the eye, he's dead, and William says, oh, I'm King of England now. And meanwhile, he'd been making promises to Margaret and her brother, and she was like, and her mother was like, no, don't trust that guy. So they come up to Scotland, and Malcolm's very pleased to meet this beautiful Germanic princess, and he's a widower, so he's like, look, you can quite happily, your family can have protection here, but no, what's even better, if you marry me, then no, the English are not going to touch you. And so she apparently she had this reputation for being very devout, and there's some folks say, well, she would have probably preferred to have been a nun, and that was one way of getting power in late Celtic, early medieval Europe, in that if you were an abbess, you had real strong power as a woman. And it was either that or be a queen. And so her mother probably said, yeah, marry him. So she does. So she's the Queen of Scots at the time, consort to Malcolm. In fact, she actually does run the country quite a lot when he's off fighting William and his descendants' forces, and that's kind of what happens. We're still kind of very separate sort of types of people, and that's kind of what happens. It is very fragmented, and again, it takes a lot longer to arrive at the England and the Scotland that James VI ends up being king of both places. So that's where it gets a bit mythic, and you've got King Arthur's story actually comes out again of the mention in the Gododin, and you've got all these Welsh legends, and Mabinogi is the Welsh cycle of legends. And I was just reading about it for a story I'm writing just now, and there's this commonality. You don't hear anything about Pictish gods, because we probably had the same ones as the Welsh. So it's why it's called the Dark Ages, because there's very little written down. And then the son of Margaret and Malcolm, well, the one that we know most about, David. David the First of Scots, he seems to be quite wise. He follows on his mother's tradition of setting up monasteries, and people, so the ordinary noblemen are like, hey, stop spending all our money on the church. But as I say to people on tours, one, you can't tell the history of Scotland without speaking about religion and politics. And two, if you're a Catholic in medieval times, setting up a monastery is your get into heaven free pass. Basically, you avoid purgatory, and that's what a lot of noblemen did in setting up what they called chantries or altars in churches. And again, if you're king, you can set up a whole monastery. And it was one of the Aberdeen ones, the one where the Marshall College is built on, the Franciscan one, was set up by the provost, Richard Voss. But the others, again, it was nobility that set them up. So it wasn't necessarily the king. But there is the Dark Age period kind of will come out of it in David's time, because he's been brought up in the Norman court. And he's, again, French would probably have been his first language, even though he would have spoken Gaelic and then Scots as well. He saw that the English way of doing things was to keep records, and he thought, right, we're doing that. And again, to keep his treasury records and everything, he had to do that. And again, he was quite good to Aberdeen. As I say, William the Lion I mentioned, that was his grandson. And it's possible that he'd already given us certain concessions before, because he certainly gave the Bishop of Aberdeen the right to levy customs on ships coming into our harbours, the River Dee. And that's why Aberdeen has the oldest harbour in the whole of Britain, founded in 1136 according to David's Charter. So this is another thing that I like telling people about, and it's absolutely true, that Aberdeen was so favoured by this early monarchy. You've got the Canmore monarchy, which ends with Robert the Bruce, and then his sister, one of his sisters, and one of his daughters marry Aberdonians that are high up in our society. And that's why we have a statue of Robert the Bruce, because he made Aberdeen rich, in that in 1319, as a thank you for supporting him in the Wars of Independence, he gave us his royal forest and all the revenues thereof, which made us the richest city in Scotland at that time in 1319. And we still have what's called the Common Good Fund, and that's still the residue of that forest's revenue to this very day, which is used for charitable purposes now. But again, Robert the Bruce saw what an important city we were, because again, you get access to the Highlands, access to your Norse countries, to the Low Countries as well, and you're nearer Norway than you would be in Edinburgh, at the Port of Leith. So we were very much favoured by royals. So we're actually very important in history. But again, it's diluted because of the way history gets taught. History of the winners gets taught a lot. But when you start reading round about it, and you get the folklore, and the folklore starts pointing you back to what might really have happened, and then you go find an archive, and then you find out, hey, I'm right. And I love it when I get proven right. And a couple of times I've found out things that eminent historians who were writing while I was still at school, that they were wrong. And I've managed to prove, they got that story wrong. I've managed to prove it. So I love that. That's just suits me fine. It actually validates everything that I learned to do, being taught to be a historian, being taught to be a librarian and a folklorist. It's all about going and finding things out. And you've got to keep asking, as my high school history teacher said, if you don't know, ask. So I keep asking.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that combination of things fits, at least in our conversation thus far, it fits kind of how you go about the world, which is, it's a unique sort of, it's different than the archaeology, like kind of route, where not that you're not concerned with facts, because that's not true. But like you're willing to forego that because the folklore is there, and you understand that stuff isn't always written down, and you don't get hung up on it, and then maybe you'll fill in the gaps with a legend that you saw from or read from some time before, and it gives us ability as the storyteller and to go do all the tours, and that's really cool, honestly.
Yeah, oh, I enjoy it because again, every time, like I was actually say filming with that TV crew last week for that show that's coming out in June, and again that's a production company based in London. They came up with he's one of the TV chefs, a guy called Ainsley Harriott. He's maybe not very well known in the States, but he's a lovely guy. Great tall black guy, gives everybody bear hugs. And I was saying to a friend today, he's his TV personality is him. He is just that nice chatty person, and I just felt totally at ease. But it was so good because him and his fellow presenter, I'm telling them stories about fishing communities and whatever, talking from personal knowledge from my family ancestry as well, and put it in context with Footy or Fitty to give it its historical name, and telling them the stuff, and they're saying back to me, "Oh, we can see you're passionate about it." And I'm like, I can't help it. It just flows out of me, and I love it. And every time I try to give it up, it finds me again. They say the pandemic I thought was the end of it, but nope, it still wants me.
It's never you're never escaping it as long as you're around. That's for sure. I feel like this is a good place to wrap it up. I know it's late there for you. I've got a couple things that I got to go run off and do, but you have, to wrap up real quick, you have some books out on Amazon, correct?
Yes.
How can the people find those?
Well, I think they're probably, if you go to hiddenaberdeentaurs.co.uk, which is my website, and if you scroll further down the front page, you'll see the link to the books. Hidden Aberdeen's the one about the city. Hidden Aberdeenshire, the coast, is the one about all the coastal history. Hidden Aberdeenshire, the land, it's waiting to come back into print because, again, the pandemic kind of mucked that up, but it should be coming back soon. And I have a couple of other sort of little bits of fiction on there as well. But if people want to follow me, we've got a Facebook page, have a podcast, The History Quine. Quine is the Scots word for girl, by the way, up in my area. It's different over in Glasgow. But yeah, I'm not sure about if it would be on the US Amazon site. I think it would be. And again, now that we're with, I'm with our publishers sort of joined a bigger publisher, and distribution should get a bit better soon. But yeah, people can get the books. I've got friends in Australia and America that have managed to get hold of them, no bother. So if you really want to learn a bit more, and if you want to come visit, now that the restrictions are soon going to be done with forever, the way the books are written, they're kind of a self-tour. So you can take a book and you can walk around certain bits, or if it's the county ones, the shire ones, you can drive around the routes and find these places for yourself. And I've challenged a couple of friends with drone cameras to go and find the more obscure ones. So yeah, I think my thing is that I want everybody to go and be their own historian and tour guide after they hear from me. Like, go and teach yourself, because you can. And the more you know where you come from, the happier you'll be understanding yourself and your culture of where you come from, and be proud of it. Like, as I say, in light of world events, being proud of your culture is extremely important, not to a sort of maybe fanatical degree, but to really have a love for understanding where you come from, and also then go and understand where other people come from, and then we'd all be happy. And it's a nice place to stop, possibly.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I really appreciate your time. I learned a lot. I'm gonna have to go listen back to this so I pick up all the details, all the details that you slipped in there that I missed. But yeah, with that, we will talk to everybody next time. Peace.